Alrighty then, let's see here. I'm going to finish writing up my graph right fast. Let's see here. Merkaba, apocalyptic traditions, messianic prophecies, church fathers, later claim these to be theophanies. Just going to finish writing this down. All right, there we go. All right. I am your host, Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as Forge Warhammer, and I am going to be talking today about Christianity. I was going to start with the Old Testament, but I have decided for the time being to go ahead and not do that. I'm going to just go straight to where Christianity began, allegedly. And there are some contrasting contentions between apologists and skeptics or critics, and higher Bible criticism has to some of the dating of this stuff. Just letting you know. So, Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! Alright, I probably should have finished taking my notes right fast. Alright, so before... This is going to be probably one of the best explanations for how Christianity formed, how it has evolved over about roughly 2,000 years of its history, how exactly it came to transpire onto itself, and just a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things to cover here, and I hope it's interesting. I was going to go back to Judaism, and I was going to cover at least the bit of Judaism and paganism, Greco-Roman paganism, Hellenistic paganism, that Christianity broke off from, but I have decided not to do that because it's not necessary to know that. It isn't necessary to know all of that stuff about the Canaanite, Mesopotamian origins of the Old Testament God. Let's see here. All right, I'm in the right thing. Yahweh appears to be the oldest rendition of this God. And there's a lot of misunderstandings in regards to when exactly the name of this particular Canaanite god actually came about. There's a lot of contentions about it. But anyways, regardless of what anybody tells you, regardless of the bullshit that you're told, Christianity, at least the earliest discernibly identifiable Christological datings that we can find, branched off from Second Temple Judaism. So, I've started with the post-Babylonian exile about 530 BC. So, let me show you my notes here, what I have. I personally begin Christianity with the post-Babylonian. By the way, only the elites were taken to Babylon. The mass of the population stayed in Judah, in southern Judah, and there was not a mass deportation of Israelites to Assyria or Judahites, Jews to Babylon. It was only the elites that were taken. That's been verifiably proven by archaeology. So, one of the themes about the separation of Christianity, I think, is the curse of Jeconiah. The curse of Jeconiah, Jeremiah 22:30, God, Yahweh, Elohim, Hashim, El Shaddai, placed a curse on King Jeconiah in the Old Testament. And what that means is that the kings of Judah could never again reign in their own land, including after the Babylonian exile. This doesn't take into account the Maccabees. But one of the central foundations for the Messianic covenant, or for the New Testament, was the curse of Jeconiah and the restoration of the Noahide laws. Acts 15. One of the things mentioned in Acts chapter 15 is that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. Cornelius, the centurion, was among the first non-Jews to become a Christian. And Peter and Paul had this debate in like 50 AD or something. Allegedly 50 AD. The apologists say 50 AD. Higher biblical critics might use a different date or might say it did not even happen, but the church in Jerusalem was under the leadership of James. Paul and Peter were fighting each other, and so there was a council called up. And in Acts chapter 15, it was decided that the Gentile converts did not have to adopt the ways of the Jews. They did not have to adopt a circumcision. They did not have to follow the Mosaic laws, the Mosaic covenant. They didn't have to follow the statutory rules of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so this was very important in the early history of Christianity because it distinguished the Christians from the Jews of the first century. Now, the Jews of the first century are not like the Jews today, and the Christians of these early centuries were not at all like the Christians of today. I know that's very confusing sometimes to understand, but anyways, the curse of Jeconiah destroyed Israel's claim to be able to rule. It destroyed the claim of the Jews in the line of King David to be able to rule over their lands, And it opened the door later for Jesus to come in and claim to be the Messiah. And then the Noahide rules were restored. One of the things that you will hear from rabbis and from Jews is that the Gentiles are supposed to follow the laws of Noah. And one of the aspects of Acts chapter 15 is the Gentile converts in the early church followed the Noahide covenant, which is quite bizarre and very interesting. All right. This is Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism began when Cyrus the Persian in 520 BC. So I'll put 520 BC. Jews return from exile, and they build the Second Temple. They build the Second Temple. This is the time of the Second Temple. It begins in 220 BC and ends in 70 AD. That's when the Romans destroyed the temple, and what it did was that it caused a major disruption in Judaism. This is when Jews began to be scattered all across the Roman Empire into these various diaspora communities, and the apostles or the early church leaders, they branched out around the Mediterranean world, and they went to these diaspora communities. Now, eventually, once Christianity, there is a lot of contention of when Christianity became a majoritively Gentile religion, but Christianity did eventually completely separate from Judaism. They became separate religions. One of the things that was occurring in Second Temple Judaism were the Merkabah apocalyptic writings. The book of Adam, the various Merkabah apocalyptic writings. There was messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Later, the church fathers claimed these to be theophanies. And I was looking about the theophany stuff, and the origin of theophanies are from the 8th century. The interpretation, or the so-called reinterpretation of the Old Testament by Christians to be theophanies and pre-fulfillment scripture was not originally claimed by the early Christians. The idea of these theophany claims happened later. So that's why I put later claim. There is also influences from paganism into early Christianity. There was this piety, this practical piety of the Roman pagans that spread into Christianity. The tales of Hercules. The tales of Hercules and the works of Hercules influenced the miraculous works of Jesus Christ. The heroic tales of the Odyssey and the Iliad, which were held in high esteem by the Greeks, influenced the writings of the New Testament. And the God-man of Alexander the Great. A lot of people do not realize how important Alexander the Great was in shaping the early church, because the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC spread Greek into the Middle East, and the language of the early church fathers was Greek. Probably also Aramaic as well, but Greek was the language that the church fathers used, the apostles used to spread the gospel. Son of God influenced Hey, what's up, Verdanian? Live with the Warhammer! Jesus has both God and man. A lot of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Ptolemies adopted this Oriental Asiatic custom of being both God and man. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt had these traditions that they were both God as well as man. Alexander the Great took this to Macedonia, and later the Roman Caesar said that they were God-men also. Alexander the Great, God-king, God-man, son of God, the son of Syllabus, or the son of Serapis. Alexander the Great claimed that he was the son of Serapis, that he was a direct descendant of the Egyptian god Serapis. And this later influenced the notion that Jesus had both God, divine, and man, human natures. That Jesus was both God and man, the hypostatic union. That came from the tales of Hercules, the tales and workings of Hercules, and from the Odyssey and the Iliad. Hypostatic union. All right, so this is the face of early Christianity. This is the truth. This is the reality of how Christianity started. It started in the Eastern Mediterranean world, around Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Egypt. This was the region that it started. Now, I'm going to talk about the origins of the god Yahweh. This is a coin of the ancient god Yahweh. And he was originally a Canaanite storm god. This is what the archaeological records say. Yahweh was an ancient Semitic deity of weather and war in the ancient Levant. The national god of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, that is actually not correct. Yahweh was not the national god of Israel and Judah. He only became the ethno-national god after the post-Babylonian exile. I know, it's bizarre, but anyways. Other academic terms often used include First Temple Judaism, from the construction of the temple in supposedly 957 BC to its destruction in 586 BC. Exilic for the period of the exile, supposedly from 586 to 539 BCE, identical with Neo-Babylonian, that would be this right here, this phase. Post-exilic or later periods in Second Temple period from the reconstruction of the temple in 515 BCE until its destruction in 70 AD. There is some Christian apologistic renderings that say it was like in 126 BC. That is incorrect. The beginning of the restoration of the Second Temple was in 515 BC. It was in 515 BC, and the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. So I'm going to show a video from Dan McClellan. But here, let's see if I can show this video. There was other gods in Israel too, by the way. The Jews did not start to become monotheistic until they were influenced by Zoroastrianism. But here's the video that I want to show.
What are our earliest references to the people of Israel and to Adonai as the patron deity of Israel? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. The fifth for today is the Spawn #1 cover by Todd McFarlane. Our earliest reference to the people of Israel comes from around 1208 to 1210 BCE. It is an inscription by a pharaoh named Merneptah, and it's part of this 10.5-foot tall victory stele. And near the bottom, it references a group known as Israel, and it says their seed is not. He's boasting about having defeated them. And there's a determinative, a way to classify this word that is attached to the name Israel in Egyptian, that classifies Israel as a people, not as a city-state or a nation, which suggests to some scholars that Israel probably started out as some kind of confederation or just group of people before it turned into a full-fledged nation. Now, our earliest references to a deity named Adonai come from over 300 years later. Toward the end of the 9th century BCE, we have 3 inscriptions that either refer to Adonai as a deity or contain names that have Yahwistic theophoric elements in them. So one of these inscriptions is the Mesha inscription, and it refers to Adonai as likely the patron deity of Israel. It talks about defeating Israel at Nebo and carting away the vessels of Adonai. We also have something called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which actually depicts in relief the king Jehu bowing before Shalmaneser, and the name Jehu has a Yahwistic theophoric element according to most scholars. There's another inscription called the Tel Dan stele, which comes from around the same time period, and it was executed by an Aramaean, probably Hazael, and it boasts about defeating some Israelite kings, as well as a leader of the House of David, which is probably the name of the dynasty that existed prior to Judah becoming its own nation. But the kings also have Yahwistic theophoric elements in their names. And so this leaves us with a question. How did we get from Israel, which means El contends, and El is the name of the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity, to Adonai as the patron deity of Israel, who is represented in the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible as more of a storm deity, a youthful warrior deity, who in the broader Northwest Semitic literature is a distinct deity from El and occupies the second tier of the Northwest Semitic pantheon? That's a question that a lot of scholars are still trying to answer, but I think we're moving in the direction of an agreement that this deity was probably brought into the northern hill country somewhere around 1000 BCE by probably nomadic tribes that are designated as Shasu by the Egyptians. And if you'd like more information on this, some good discussions are Tommaso Omer's book, The Invention of God, which is probably the most accessible of all of these. Mark Smith's book, God in Translation, is a great discussion of how the God of Israel relates to the other gods of the nations around them. Daniel Fleming's book, Adonai, Glimpses of History in a Divine Name, is a great discussion of Egyptian inscriptions from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE that refer to a land that seems to have a very similar name to the name Adonai, but it's not yet a divine name. We have Ted Lewis's Magisterial, The Origin and Character of God, which talks at some length about the origins of Adonai. And then Robert Miller's book, Adonai, Origin of a Desert God, talks about the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis and how Adonai may come from this sky deity who was worshipped by the Midianites.
All right. And then Yahweh was not the original God of
Adonai was
Israel.
not the original God of Israel. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the majority of scholars who study the earliest periods of Israel's history are in pretty widespread agreement that the original patron deity of the people of Israel, the original God of Israel, was not Adonai. It was the aged and patriarchal high deity over the Northwest Semitic pantheon, El. Thus the name Israel. El contends. And we have archaeological evidence of the existence of a people group referred to as Israel as early as about 1208 or 1210 BCE with the Merneptah stele. We don't have any reference whatsoever to any deity named Adonai anywhere in ancient West Asia until over 300 years later, when we get the Mesha inscription and the Tel Dan stele and the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, where we have references to kings who have Yahwistic theophoric elements in their names, and we also have reference to Adonai as the patron deity of Israel. So somewhere between the end of the 13th century BCE and somewhere in the 9th century BCE, the patron deity shifted from El to Adonai, or more in alignment with the scholarly consensus, Adonai was conflated with El, and they were considered one and the same deity, who was then considered the patron deity over the nation of Israel. So where did Adonai come from? They're not known from any other pantheon from anywhere in the area, but we do have a couple of inscriptions from Egypt from the 13th and the 14th centuries BCE that refer to a Shasu people group who occupied a territory that was referred to as the land of YHW and then a glottal stop, an Egyptian version of the Hebrew Aleph. And a lot of scholars think this toponym, this place name, probably lent itself to the name of a deity over a group of nomadic Shasu people who migrated into the northern hill country, maybe in the 11th or 10th centuries BCE, bringing with them their own patron deity, who then was inserted into the Northwest Semitic pantheon on the second tier, and that deity was assigned a storm deity profile, much like the Northwest Semitic storm deity Baal. And one of the reasons scholars think this is because the earliest literary layers in the Hebrew Bible that refer to Adonai, represent Adonai, is a youthful warrior storm deity, precisely like Baal. And there's also a lot of competition between Adonai and Baal in the Hebrew Bible. And so likely what happened is this group brought this deity in that at some point was conflated, probably because a king wanted to consolidate power or because a devotee of Adonai became king and again wanted to consolidate power. And so a campaign of conflation was undertaken to identify El as Adonai, and that's what we see reflected in the Hebrew Bible. And if you'd like to learn more about these two different deities, there are a bunch of books that have been published over the last 30 years or so that go into an awful lot of detail. And the fit for this video has been my Data Over Dogma hoodie. And for those who are asking where it comes from,
all right, so there is the influences of Alexander the Great, the heroic tales of Hercules and the Odyssey and the Iliad that influenced the early Christians, the pietistic, the kind of good pietistic influence of the Greco-Roman Persians had an influence on how the Mass was performed in the early church. First Temple Judaism appears to have originated from a Yahwistic cult, and also El Shaddai and Yahweh were two different gods. And apparently the earliest people to worship this was the tribe of the Shasu, who lived in the 13th century BC. They are mentioned in the Merneptah Stele. And they settled in the southern hill country between the 13th centuries BC and the 8th centuries BC. So the translation from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age period and kind of the 8th century BC could be considered, that's when the first Olympics were held in Greece, around 776 BC, actually. Another major influence on how Second Temple Judaism was actually Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism believed in this kind of duality between good and evil, and it had the concept of one God. And it was very impactful and very influential. And there's actually a lot of commonalities between Zoroaster and Jesus Christ. And Jesus was not the only major so-called Son of God, prophet God-man or God-man in the Middle East in this time period. There was actually many. including I can't think of it right now, but there was the Gnostics. There was all sorts. There was 50 different Christian cults.
You may never have heard of it.
But I want to point out that the main difference between First and Second Temple Judaism, there was a lot of influence from Zoroastrianism on Judaism, as well as on Christianity.
But you've likely been influenced by it. This little-known religion has inspired Voltaire, Nietzsche, and Freddie Mercury. George R.R. Martin based a Game of Thrones character on it. The car brand Mazda was named after its main god. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have all been profoundly shaped by it. And yet only a very few people follow it today. We're talking about Zoroastrianism, arguably the world's oldest monotheistic religion. But what made it such an influential faith, and how did it shape the world? Zoroastrianism was founded by the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as he's known in the West, around the 6th century BCE in ancient Persia, present-day Iran. The exact dates are still a matter of debate, and it's possible that the religion goes even further back. We also don't know much about the details of Zoroaster's life or where he lived. Most of the little that we do know comes from the Avesta, a collection of Zoroastrian religious scriptures. Zoroaster's family belonged to a nomadic pastoralist society, and his name Zarathustra, which translates to owner of old or gray camels, reflects this lifestyle. It seems that Zoroaster was a priest of the ancient Iranian religion, but when he was in his 30s, he began to have visions from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Rather than try to overthrow the existing polytheistic religion, Zoroaster tried to reform it on the basis of existing social and economic values. When he tried to spread his new ideas, he faced opposition and hostility from those who defended the old religious practices and societal norms. After many years of preaching, Zoroaster finally won the support of King Vishtaspa, also known as Histaspes, who embraced Zoroastrianism and helped spread the new faith. Little is known about Zoroaster's death. According to some later Zoroastrian traditions, Zoroaster was killed in his late 70s by a foreign invader in a temple. Under the Achaemenid Empire, particularly King Cyrus the Great, Zoroastrianism became the state religion and flourished. This continued under subsequent Persian empires, including the Parthian and Sasanian empires, spreading its influence throughout the region. Regardless of how little we know about Zoroaster, what we do know is that he was a visionary who changed his world. His ideas emphasized monotheism, which was a significant shift from the polytheistic religions that were prevalent at the time. What's more, Zoroastrianism also laid the foundation for many concepts that would become central to the Abrahamic religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We'll talk about that in detail further on. Zoroaster's teachings, which were revealed to him in a series of visions from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the religion, can be found in the Avesta, the primary collection of sacred texts of Zoroastrianism. Written in an old form of the Persian language known as Avestan, the Avesta isn't a single book, but a compilation of various texts that were written over many centuries. This includes the Gathas, which are 17 hymns believed to be composed by Zoroaster himself. The Gathas are at the core of the Zoroastrian faith. So, what exactly did Zoroaster preach? Zoroastrianism is all about the worship of one god, Ahura Mazda, who represents wisdom. The religion also introduced the concepts of dualism, depicting the eternal battle between the forces of good and evil. Good is represented by the spirit Sapenta Manu, and evil is symbolized by Angra Mainyu, both of which are under Ahura Mazda. This dualistic worldview is the basis for the fundamental ethical principle of Zoroastrianism, the constant battle between good and evil. Those who practice the faith are encouraged to be active participants in this battle, choosing the path of righteousness over the path of falsehood. This ability to choose is one of the unique aspects of Zoroastrianism. It emphasizes free will. Followers are taught that they have the power and responsibility to choose between good and evil in their thinking, speaking, and actions. A trio of principles often summarized as good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. You can choose your path, but there will be consequences for your choices. This brings us to Zoroastrian eschatology, which was unique for its time. Eschatology is defined as the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind. In Zoroastrianism, this includes beliefs in a future savior, a final judgment, and the eventual triumph of good over evil. After death, an individual's soul is judged based on their life deeds, with the virtuous granted a place in heaven and the wicked condemned to hell. While it's true that there have always been variations of heaven and hell even before Zoroastrianism, these were vague and not emphasized as places of reward and punishment based on ethical conduct. An important point to note is that Zoroastrians are often called fire worshippers, but this is a misunderstanding of their religious practices. In Zoroastrianism, fire isn't worshipped as a god, but rather revered as a physical representation or symbol of the divine, specifically of the wisdom of Ahura Mazda. Fire serves as a medium through which spiritual insight and wisdom are gained. In Zoroastrian fire temples, a sacred fire is kept continuously burning by the priests, representing the eternal presence of Ahura Mazda, righteousness, and truth. The fire is also a symbol of cosmic order and the light of wisdom that drives away the darkness of chaos and ignorance. It's sacred because of its purifying qualities, burning away evil and destruction. This reverence for purity extends to the environment, leading to a strong tradition of environmental stewardship. As some have said, Zoroastrianism is a very ecologically aware religion, which has led to some commentators calling it the first green movement. But what's most interesting is Zoroastrianism's impact on the development of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The concepts of monotheism, heaven and hell, a Messiah, final judgment, and resurrection, all central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have roots in Zoroastrian beliefs. But how did Judaism become influenced by Zoroastrianism? Scholars believe that this occurred during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. It was Cyrus the Great, a Zoroastrian, who liberated the Jewish people from Babylon and allowed them to return to their homeland. He even supported them in rebuilding their temple. This interaction between Zoroastrians and Jews likely led to an exchange and incorporation of theological ideas. And as the Jewish religion was remade after the catastrophe of the exile, these Zoroastrian teachings began to filter into the Jewish religious culture. This, in turn, influenced Christianity and Islam. But it's also likely that as Islam expanded into Persia, there was considerable interaction between Muslims and Zoroastrians. So, how exactly did Zoroastrianism impact the Abrahamic religions? Let's take a look at several significant ideas that may have come from the ancient Persian religion. Monotheism. While Judaism was already trending towards monotheism, the strict monotheistic belief system of Zoroastrianism, with Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity, may have helped crystallize Jewish monotheistic belief. This is further reflected in Christianity and Islam. Angels and demons. The Zoroastrian cosmology includes various spiritual beings, such as angels and demons. These concepts likely influenced the development of angelic and demonic beings in the Abrahamic faiths. The Jewish and Christian idea of a personal guardian angel may also have been inspired by the Zoroastrian figure of the Fravashi, the divine guardian spirit of each individual human being. Dualism. Zoroastrianism presents a dualistic universe, constantly torn between good and evil. This cosmic struggle influenced the concept of good and evil in Abrahamic religions, particularly the dichotomy between God and Satan. Eschatology. Zoroastrian beliefs in a savior, final judgment, and an end-time renovation of the world have parallels in the messianic apocalyptic and resurrection themes found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Heaven and hell. Zoroastrianism has clearly defined notions of heaven and hell based on moral and ethical actions in one's life. Similar concepts of an afterlife, including divine judgment, are central in the Abrahamic faiths. Before the exile and Persian contact, Jews believed that souls of the dead went to a boring Hades-like place called Sheol. However, there's a marked change after the exile, where the idea of a moralized afterlife, with heavenly rewards for the good and hellish punishment for the evil, begin to appear in Judaism. Another interesting note is that one of the words for heaven in the Bible is paradise. It comes from the ancient Iranian words paridesa, meaning enclosed garden. It's one of the very few definite Persian loanwords. In the Bible, Satan. The Zoroastrian figure of Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, is often seen as a precursor to the figure of Satan in the Abrahamic religions. The similarities between Zoroastrianism and the Abrahamic religions are just too glaring to ignore, yet many believers of the Abrahamic religions may not readily acknowledge such influences. So, Zoroastrianism doesn't often get the credit that it deserves. The arrival of Islam in Persia in the 7th century marked the decline of Zoroastrianism as a major religion. Many Zoroastrians fled to India to escape religious persecution, becoming known as Parsis. The small community of Zoroastrians mainly reside in Iran and India, with significant diaspora in North America.
All right, so there's a major influence of Persian Zoroastrianism in Second Temple Judaism. There's also a lot of Babylonian influences that were poured into Judaism too during this time. A lot of Mesopotamian influences as well. So there is a Mesopotamian influence on Judaism. Here's Styx Hexenhammer talking about the Sumerian origins of Judaism and Christianity. I'm not going to play that, though. Let's see here. Try to find the Dan McClellan. Dan McClellan is the go-to guy in regards to like the real authenticity. Jesus was not crucified according to first century Christians. You know something, this is what Muslims also say, and so do Jews. Rabbinical Jews and Muslims will say the same thing, that Jesus was not actually crucified.
And you need me to show you in the Bible where Jesus is God and how he prayed to God the Father while he was God the Son here on earth. Just ask. That's all you got to do.
All right, let's see it.
Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God.
So I think this is a wonderful illustration of the manipulation of the New International Version. You'll notice as the creator read this passage, that phrase very nature occurred twice and had a footnote marker on it each time. And that's because if you go look down in the footnotes, you get what the Greek term underlying that translation actually says. And the footnotes say, or the form of, because the Greek word there is morphe, which means form, shape, appearance. Absolutely does not mean very nature. That is a later reading of the hypostatic union into this text. It's a convenient way to assert that the Bible acknowledges that Jesus is in very nature God, but also in very nature 100% human. But the author of Philippians had absolutely no clue whatsoever about that. This is a reflection of what's called the metamorphosis myth, or the descent of deity.
And the aposteosis or the metamorphosis thing is taken from the works and the tributes of Hercules. If you read in Greek mythology, Hercules did 10 labors. And like there is sites all over Greece and the Greek-speaking world where allegedly Hercules had been there and he had done a labor, and this got into the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. This is where the metamorphosis comes from that, and it went into becoming the hypostatic union. The labors of Hercules were later adopted into the labors and works of the Church and the apostles.
To human form, like Dionysus.
And the hero cult, like the hero cults and the Dionysiac cult, influenced the later praising of Jesus and in the New Testament as well.
No clue whatsoever about that. This is a reflection of what's called the metamorphosis myth, or the descent of deity to human form. Like Dionysus says in the Bacchae, I have changed my form, morphe, from that of a god to that of a human. So in Philippians, we have this myth about Jesus in a divine preexistence, who then trades out their divine appearance form for human appearance form to humble himself, and then afterwards will be exalted again by virtue of being given the divine name. And there's a wonderful discussion in Paul Holloway's recent hermeneutic commentary on Philippians of how all of this works, how this fits into broader Greco-Roman and even Greco-Roman Jewish literature, and talks about how Paul is taking up the earlier Greco-Roman tradition of these mediatory figures as name-bearing angels, which is something that I've talked about quite a bit on my channel.
Now let's take a quick look at when he was praying to God the Father as God the Son.
Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done.
So God the Son took on the nature of a servant, and he was obedient to God the Father. He said, not my will, as God the Son, fully God, fully man, because I'm taking on the nature of a servant. I'm humbling myself. I'm going to pray to God, my Father.
So this is a different author who says absolutely nothing about Jesus being God. So this creator is imposing the presupposition of univocality on here to insist that however they interpret Philippians, that interpretive lens must also be applied to Luke. And again, we're just retrojecting the hypostatic union back into a text that knew absolutely nothing about it, because the hypostatic union was not developed until the 4th and 5th centuries, as powerful people were arguing over how to make this all philosophically fit.
And where does it say he's God the Son? I'm glad you asked. Let's go see.
John 1:18. No one has ever seen God, the Father, but God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. You just going to reject Scripture or what?
So you'll notice we've got those footnote markers once again that this creator is entirely ignoring, as well as bracketed words, because this is another manipulation of the text by the translators. The Greek underlying this translation absolutely, indisputably does not say God the only Son. But these translators want a more explicit proof text for the Trinity, this notion that God exists in 3 equal persons. And so they're manipulating the text. There is a text critical decision that we have to make here, though, before we can translate this text. There are 2 different primary readings known from the manuscripts. The majority of manuscripts have this phrase, monogenes huios, which means the only Son. And this is a title that the author of the Gospel of John uses multiple times in reference to Jesus. It's also known from other texts also attributed to John elsewhere in the New Testament. A minority of manuscripts, but very early manuscripts, have this reading monogenes theos, which would mean the only God, which is a title that is not known from anywhere in the New Testament or any writings anywhere near the composition of the Gospel of John. But that makes for a handy proof text for the Trinity. And so scholars who like that idea will leverage text critical principles to try to argue that monogenes theos is more likely. And the main one they'll use is this principle called lectio difficilior, which refers to this observation that it is more likely that a scribe will change a difficult text to a more easy text than it is that they will change an easy text to a more difficult text. Scribes are more likely to clean up manuscripts rather than make them messier. And so monogenes theos makes less sense in context, and so that one is probably earlier. There are problems with leveraging that argument, however. One is that the manuscripts in question were being transmitted in the middle of fierce Christological debates about whether Jesus was equal to God and if Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. So whether or not monogenes theos is more difficult or easier is a judgment call, and I would say is a pretty muddy one. Additionally, this observation is most helpful when we have two manuscripts that we're comparing and we're trying to decide which is easier. It doesn't really tell us what the author wrote. That requires pulling in a lot of other observations. And even folks who would like this to be a proof text for the Trinity acknowledge that it is very unlikely that the author wrote this. In fact, the editor for Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the New Testament even had to add a note to Metzger's discussion of this passage, saying it is doubtful that the author would have written monogenes theos, which may be a primitive transcriptional error in the Alexandrian tradition. In this time period, they used what's known as nomina sacra, which are abbreviations for divine names and references to deity, where you take the first and the last letter of the word, you put them together, and you write a line over the top. So the difference between monogenes huios and monogenes theos comes down to a single letter, whether it was epsilon sigma or whether it was theta sigma with a line over the top. And so it is obviously possible, maybe even plausible, that monogenes theos was original, but most likely it was monogenes huios, which was...
All right, so there's two different Greek words, mogenes theos and mogenes theos. And these different first century Greek Chioni words, these late antiquity Greek words, were used interchangeably by the apostles, possibly, and they don't actually signify a divine interpretation of Jesus taking the divine name. Again, I would say that the influence of Jesus as the Son of God came from the notions of the God-man, like the Dionysiac cult of Dionysius being God and taking the form, metamorphosizing into a man, or Alexander the Great claiming that he is the son of Serapis when he goes to Egypt. These kind of things were very popular. In fact, the Cynics and the Stoics are actually mentioned in one of Paul's letters, or Paul's lettering. Another thing too that is never mentioned is that the Gospels that we have are probably not the original Gospels. Is it possible that the Gospels were written in the first century? Yes. But we don't know. We do not know. We don't have...
You need me to show you in the Bible where Jesus...
We just do not have enough collected data to know for sure. What we do have, or what we do know, is that the Gospels that we do have, the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, come from a very similar origin. They're very alike. They're very common, word for word, even in the original Greek. And they probably come from a Q script that was written early in the 2nd century, or late in the 2nd century AD. And then we do know that the Gospel of John was written probably in the 2nd century. That's all that we know. I'm trying to bring this up. Also, the book of Daniel was written during the Hellenistic period. The book of Daniel was probably written about 150 BC. So let's see here. Mark chapter 2 also does not claim that Jesus had divinity. That actually kind of supports the Jehovah's Witnesses' belief that God, that Jesus was actually an early creature that God created, and he wasn't actually God. That would actually, let's see here. When were the Gospels written? Yeah, the Gospels that we have are from the 2nd and 3rd century. And they probably were not written by none of the apostles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John did not write those 4 Gospels. And there was like 8 or 9 or even 15 other Gospels that were written in the 1st century. Some of them probably by Gnostics, others perhaps maybe Ebionites. We don't really know. There's no evidence that the Ebionites had their own gospel, but some attest that the Ebionites had a gospel. We don't know. So I want to show this. Verdanian 808 says, Nimrod of Babylon wore hammer. What do you mean, Verdanian? Let's see here. Verdanian says, live with the Warhammer. Interdimensional Lizard says, interesting. Demented Nazi Hanol all said hi. Hey, Demented Nazi Hanol, what is up? With a banana peeled banana emoji or emoji. Verdanian says, at Demented Nazi Hanol, oh, greetings. And then Verdanian says, Nimrod of Babylon. Are you talking about the guy that built the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis? Specifically, Genesis 20, Genesis 9, Genesis 15, Genesis 14, 13. Or actually, I think it was Genesis 12. Yeah, Genesis 12, Genesis 13. All right, on gospel authorship.
Hey everybody, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written anonymously and almost certainly not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors. The closest we get is the Gospel of John, saying that the beloved disciple was the one who wrote these things. But the very next statement is, we know that his testimony is true. We also have the author speaking in the first person plural in the first chapter on 2 different occasions. And so most likely the Gospel of John was written by a group of people whose primary source was a narrative account written by someone they identified as the beloved disciple, who was later identified as the Apostle John. Now, the first person to actually assign traditional authorship to the 4 Gospels as we know them today was Irenaeus of Lyons, who was writing around 180 CE, so a full century or more after the composition of the Gospels. Many people point to Papias of Hierapolis, writing between 120 and 130 CE, as identifying Matthew and Mark as authors of Gospels. But this is very problematic, and there is not a good case to make that Papias is actually referring to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today. To begin, Matthew is identified as having been written originally in Hebrew, which is not true. Additionally, Papias says that Matthew was a sayings gospel, which is also not true. It's not a sayings gospel. It's a historical narrative that has sayings embedded in it. Papias says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter and recorded everything that Peter said and put it together in no particular order, again, as a sayings gospel. Neither of those details is true of the Gospel of Mark either. We also have data that indicates Papias did not know of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today. He never quotes from them. He also says he doesn't really like the written accounts of Jesus's life, preferring the living voices, meaning the living people he interviewed who knew people who knew people who knew Jesus. And a good indication of this is that Papias's account of Judas's death has absolutely nothing to do with Matthew's account. Papias did not find the account in Matthew, if he knew it at all, as authoritative. He preferred another story, which has Judas swelling up to larger than the size of a house and exuding a foul odor and basically exploding all over the place and creating a stench that covered the area where he died for over a century. So the argument that Papias knows the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them and attributed authorship to them is not strong. So what happened between 130 CE and about 180 CE, when Irenaeus of Lyons already has the 4 traditional authors named? Most likely, someone in Rome produced a single manuscript of all 4 Gospels and either assigned that traditional authorship in that manuscript, or someone very shortly afterwards assigned that authorship. And that manuscript then circulated widely, became very popular, and so authorship was established. Now, a lot of people are going to respond, well, why aren't there competing claims of authorship? And I don't think that's a very good argument. To begin, everybody seems perfectly happy with anonymity in the 2nd century CE. Justin Martyr, for instance, writing around the middle of the 2nd century CE, just calls them the memoirs of the apostles. And that seemed to be great for everybody. So all it would really take would be one attempt to assign authorship that gets very widespread and popular for it to become authoritative enough that there wouldn't really be any challengers. And that's particularly true if there was a great logic for the assignment of that authorship, which there is for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. To begin, we already have this tradition of Matthew and Mark having written text associated with Jesus's sayings. But what were the 4 most important disciples or followers of Jesus in the New Testament? We have Peter, James, John, and Paul. So why weren't the 4 of them assigned authorship of the Gospels? Well, James died pretty early on as a martyr, before the Gospels were even written. So James is out. But it's easy to replace James with Matthew because, like Papias mentioned, we have this tradition of Matthew writing something in Hebrew. And the Gospel of Matthew, as we know it today, is the most Jewish of the Gospels. Matthew is actually almost certainly a Judaizer and is quoting heavily from the Hebrew Bible. Matthew's Gospel is also the only one that mentions the calling of Matthew by that name. In the other Gospels, the tax collector is Levi, but in Matthew, the tax collector is named as Matthew. So this is a wonderful candidate for the text Papias says was written by Matthew, and they're not really concerned for the incongruity between the details Papias provides and the actual text of the Gospel of Matthew. So that leaves Peter, John, and Paul. Now, Peter already had a spurious gospel attributed to him, so they probably wouldn't want to assign another one to him. But we already have Papias' tradition that Mark, the interpreter of Peter, was the one who wrote down.
All right. I'll continue this another time. There'll be part 2 and part 3. I'll see you later. Bye.